Community means strength. Starhawk from Dreaming the Dark, Magic, Sex, and Politics, published by our own Beacon Press. We are all longing to go home someplace we have never been. A place half remembered and half envisioned we can only catch glimpses of from time to time. Community. Somewhere there are people to whom we can speak with passion without having the words catch in our throats. Somewhere a circle of hands will open to receive us. Eyes will light up as we enter. Voices will celebrate with us whenever we come into our own power. Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done. Arms to hold us when we falter. A circle of healing, a circle of friends, someplace where we can be free.
So when you open up this historic record book of Michael Servetus Unitarian Society, MSUS, the first page has a list of founders with the date May 26, 1966 noted. Glenn W. Thompson, Edith M. Thompson, Wyman Smith, Grace Smith, Sewald Rechtel, known as Sig, Martha Rechtel, known as Marty, Robert Hughes, Barbara Hughes, Robert Metcalf, and Constant Metcalf. Then there's a page with actual signatures of the 23 incorporating members dated June 1st, 1966. It was fun to talk with a couple of the founders and one of the incorporating members this past week to better understand how the congregation began. I also heard from a handful of other congregants who found MSUS a decade later or more. This month, our theme is heritage. Hence, we are digging into the heritage of our congregation. As I listened to the founders, I began to realize just how different those earlier times were in the life of the congregation. In 1969, Fridley, a city of a total of 10 square miles, operated like a small town compared to today. In 1950, the population was 3,796, under 4,000 people. By 1960, it had grown to 15,000, compared, you could imagine a Bemidji or Hugo today. And now Fridley is twice that size, recorded as 31,897. There was no Unitarian or Universalist congregation in this area that I talked about. Folks from here and further north drove down into Minneapolis to attend the First Unitarian Society. I heard stories of Wyman and Grace Smith and Edith and Glenn Thompson, who were both movers and shakers when the church began. Wyman was a local attorney. He was the municipal attorney for the city of Fridley. He was the municipal attorney for the city of Coon Rapids. He was president of the Rotary, and he was active in the Masons. You can kind of get a sense about, he had his own law business too, so connected to very many people. He was so influential in this area that he was inducted into the Fridley Hall of Fame in 2006. And actually, when I looked at that list, I recalled that there were other people. We actually had 5 members from MSUS from those early days who were all inducted into the Fridley Hall of Fame. I don't tell you this so that you can understand Wyman's resume. Instead, I tell you this as a way to demonstrate how well known and respected and embedded in the Fridley community Wyman and other congregants were. I'm guessing that all the people who drove down to First Unitarian on Sunday mornings didn't love the drive. The Fridleyites and others in neighboring suburbs found each other through First Unitarian, and they already had started a strong book club that helped them know each other and become familiar with each other's lives. Sig and Marty guessed that there were probably like 20 people in that book club, and a part of that still continues today. It was said that they'd talk about books for about 5 minutes. I don't know if you found this true, and then politics for the rest of the time. That's what I was told. So when Wyman drove by a little Episcopalian church that he passed every day and saw that it was for sale, he went for it. Here's how it's been captured in our records. On a rainy Sunday, late in May 1966, 3 members of First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, on their way home from church, stopped at a small Episcopal church at East River Road and Mississippi Street in Fridley. They heard that the building was about to be sold, and they decided the facilities would be just right for a fellowship to serve the Unitarians in Anoka County. That afternoon, they, with 3 other couples, decided to form a fellowship. On June 1, 1966, an organizational meeting was held. 23 Unitarians signed as charter members, a board of trustees was elected, and articles of incorporation were drawn up. Michael Servetus Unitarian Society, MSUS, was chosen as the name of the new fellowship in order to honor the first Unitarian martyr. To help provide income for the operating expenses, an auction was held on Labor Day, 1966. The auction continued as an annual tradition for many years. As you may guess, there was no connection between the founders of MSUS and the fellowship movement that ended right about the time that our congregation was created. It sounds like the building was bought for something like $5,000, I'm told, and articles of incorporation were drawn up and trustees are in place without any conversation with the Unitarian Universalist Association. From what members gathered, the UUA wasn't super happy about this fact. Who knows when they were actually informed about this newly formed congregation. One long-term member wrote, "The UUA wasn't mentioned much. Our founding matriarch was somewhat disdainful of Boston." That's where the UUA was. We began developing a better relationship with the larger association when Sarah Green went to work for the Prairie Star District and Chris Green joined the district board. Chris recruited several of us to take roles at the district level. Our involvement in the district led to some of us being more involved in the UUA. And since then, Chris in the back and Sarah next to him and Kathy Burek were both Prairie Star District presidents and president of the district's President Association. So they were holding it down. Edith Thompson and Grace Smith were said to have put endless hours into the church. Edith, who lived to be over 100 and remained the matriarch until she could no longer, was quite the go-getter. I heard that when she was 85, her doctor told her that she had to slow down. The doctor suggested that she bring in a list of all the activities she was involved in so they could pare it down. After that exercise, she was down to 11 different groups. The congregation was, however, connected to Unitarianism. Once a month, the topic of the service would be a famous Unitarian. Several were led by lay members, local faculty members from university, public sector leaders, and leaders in nonprofits. They met on Sunday nights, so not to compete with the service at First Unitarian. They scheduled services at night for a year until the membership kind of rose up and said they wanted to have a real church. Edith had been in charge of the forum at First Unitarian, and she had a large Rolodex of contacts. Those of you who aren't familiar with Rolodex, I love them and I miss them so much. It was like these little cards where you would put either a business card or you would write contact on, and it was like a wheel. And so it was alphabetically ordered, and you could spin it and get to like whatever name you needed to and have your contact. So she had a big spindle full of contacts. Religious education for the kids was a priority from the start. Doyle Mullen was counting off the number of kids present from those first 23 members. The Nelsons had 6 children, another family had 5, many had 3. Families and kids were expected to volunteer in religious education classroom. Doyle chuckled when he said sometimes you'd go to the service and there would only be like 10 people there because everybody else was working in religious education. There was even a swell in the religious education program when 75 kids attended, and they had to use the school across the street. Most of those kids were children of congregants, but I heard from more than one source that some of those kids were dropped off while the parents had no affiliation with the church whatsoever and didn't attend services. The congregation went through highs and lows in terms of religious education and the number of kids. At one point, when there were no kids, Barbara Hughes stepped up and said that she would be the Sunday school. She was there every week, greeting families and kids, and it did grow. Later dates, Sarah Green and Chad Snyder took on the responsibility of leading the religious education program. The congregation hired their first staff member in 1986. That was a religious education professional part-time, 20 years after the congregation was founded. The number of kids and youth rose and fell throughout the years. More from our written history. 4 years later, in 1970, the Oakley Drive land was acquired as a donation from the Wyman Smiths law firm. You can see Wyman showing up again, huh? A fellowship hall was constructed on the site. The original sanctuary, which was moved from East River Road site, as witnessed by Beth Hatoni Hughes outside of her elementary school windows. She watched it drive down the road. And then it became a second, the sanctuary was actually put on the second floor with seating for 72. To finance the remodeling, money was realized from the sale of building improvement bonds and from a rental agreement with the local Masons. I was told that they also borrowed money from the Humanist Credit Union. Who knew that there was such a thing? The Masons met regularly in the fellowship hall, and I was told that when it was built, the Masons had a power source put right in the center of the room because that's where their altar was. They met in the building for about 5 years. All those bonds were paid off early. We had a very fiscally responsible and kind of frugal group of folks who really got it done. The land behind the church, for those of you who recall the church, was actually getting developed, and we had to invest the money in order to get like the infrastructure so the houses could be built. And the architect initially thought, the contractor initially thought it was much worse than what actually ended up happening. So we got a kickback of somewhere between $50,000 and $1,000, $30 or $50,000 from the contractor because he didn't have to do the work he thought he would have to. So it was a good time. It was a do-it-yourself church. Our history states that in the early years, the women of the church provided funds for most of the furnishings, and volunteer labor was provided by members for building maintenance. Some of that was true up until the very day we sold our building, that we really did have a crew of folks on building and grounds who were tending to that building in such a beautiful way. I was told that much of the life in Fridley was due to the League of Women Voters at that time, and we had a lot of members active in the League. The women of the congregation were also well known and well respected. What had been called the quiet revolution in the world of work shifted drastically around this time. The rate of women in the job market increased threefold from 1941 to 1971. By 1965, Minnesota had 42% of women ages 16 to 64 in the workforce. So that was 42, now it's more like 59.9, so 60. At one point in the 2000s, it peaked at 68%. So the women in the workforce has been a major shift, although that number dropped significantly with the recession and then following with COVID. As some of you may recall from those photos that used to be in the Narthex, that sanctuary was up on top of the fellowship hall. In 1991, they moved it back down to the ground level, and they expanded several feet back to increase the capacity. The architecture was instructed to make it look like a New England church, since that's where Unitarian was rooted. Wyman, who grew up in a small town, had an affinity for auctions. He would help clients settle their estates, and when the estate sale had remaining unsold stuff, he would have it all packed up and keep it for the auction. The annual auction tradition started on the very first Labor Day, as you heard, and this was the real deal. The auction was a major fundraiser. Cars were sold, other large items. The old fellowship hall, which was about maybe 2/3 of the size of this room, would be filled with stuff over the summer and then sorted before Labor Day. The city even permitted the church to put a banner across Mississippi Street advertising the auction. It doesn't sound like that happens very often anymore for private organizations. Eventually, the church had to haul off a lot of unwanted stuff following the sales, but it was definitely a community builder and a lucrative fundraiser. Bob Hughes, Barbara Hughes' husband, took the role of minister. He gained the credential to be able to officiate weddings and would officiate memorial services and child dedications as well. He'd been involved in theater in college and I was told that he would have potentially liked to have been a minister. When he died, Kathy Burek took on that role for the congregation. Early on, the fellowship, like so many others, was described as militant humanist, kind of anti-Christian, and adverse to the ritual of any kind. Several people cited a heated discussion about the use of candles. They lit a candle, just like we do, as part of the kind of chalice lighting at the beginning of the service. The debate went deeper as the pulpit committee came up with a structure for the service that included hymns and responsive readings and the lighting of the chalice. As I heard, the debate described, it was quite heated and somewhat hostile, with a little disrespect and name-calling going on, but there were people who bore deep scars from previous religious backgrounds, and from seeing the rise of fascism that made some people suspicious of certain structures and actions. The candles and the order of service prevailed, and some people left the church at that time. The congregation also prided itself on keeping politics out of the pulpit. It was described as part of the church's DNA. There was a group of conservatives, individuals and couples who were part of the core founders and early members who were active and held leadership positions. And, not a surprise to you, the congregation was very friendly and social. A social committee planned monthly potlucks, said to be the best attended Sundays of the month, plays that were performed at the church, theater outings with congregants, and other social gatherings outside the building. These social events and gatherings were a major part of the fabric of the church. Church members had people over to their homes after outings, and it wasn't uncommon for a group of folks to head out to brunch after the fellowship hall had been cleaned up. Lifelong relationships were formed. Doyle talked of camping every year with a total of 5 families. The 20 kids from 5 families grew to know each other in and out of the religious education classrooms. It was a different time, when kids were in far fewer activities and family time was less stretched than it is today. As I noted, congregants also came to know each other through local common shared organizations that they were part of, such as the Parks and Recs and Springbrook Nature Center, and of course the League of Women Voters. So I want to return back to the fellowship movement for a moment. Author Holly Ulbricht wrote a book titled The Fellowship Movement, A Growth Strategy and Its Legacy. And she writes this about fellowships that were started by the UUA, but I think our fellowship wasn't that different from the ones that were planted. She says, the positive view maintains that congregations planted as lay-led fellowships between 1948 and 1967 saved Unitarianism from near extinction and converted a regional religious movement into a truly national one. Along with growing the denomination, fellowships brought innovation, vitality, and lay leadership into a religious community greatly in need of fresh air. I love that line. At the end of the spectrum is the view that the fellowship movement spawned small, introverted, even hostile groups that didn't want to grow or welcome newcomers. They didn't want to identify with the larger denomination, and they represented Unitarian Universalism in ways that didn't reflect the larger movement's self-understanding. She continues, the fellowship story didn't end in 1967. Many new lay-led congregations have emerged since the end of the fellowship movement. One of the congregations listed in the 2005 UUA directory, I don't know what that says. Anyway, of the congregations listed in the 2005 UUA directory, 277, more than 1/4, were established in that window between 1967 and 2004. Some of them were sponsored by the UUA, and some were supported by neighboring congregations, and others arose independently, kind of like ours. Of the 277, 168 are still relatively small or without full-time ministry, although some have consulting or part-time ministries. These new congregations are heavily concentrated in 7 states far from Boston: California, Florida, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oregon, Texas, and Washington. States experiencing rapid population growth, mainly from other parts of the country. Unitarian Universalism is alive and well in the 21st century, she says, due in no small part to the fellowship movement. It is livelier, more vital, a more diverse religious movement because of the pioneers who took the faith to new places and created a frontier kind of religion. She continues that change took place among the senior partners in Unitarian Universalism as well, and the entire movement absorbed some of the empowerment of the laity. They modified their ways of worship, they experimented with new ways to be in community, and they appreciated the value of smaller communities within the larger whole. Unitarian Universalism today has not only been challenged by, but also enriched and revitalized by the unique phenomena of fellowships. Every congregation is unique. Ours was gifted with connected, locally powerful people who saw the opportunity to start a church and did so. Men and women who gave tirelessly to the formation of the society, religious education, and Sunday services. They wove together a community that was joyful and based in Unitarian Universalism that has withstood the test of time. We have definitely moved from disdain for the UUA to being very connected, both regionally and nationally. The move to professional ministry and staff came in a time of life when Americans' families were changing. What worked in the beginning needed to be altered for the years that followed, just as we are adjusting to changing times today. Sig and Marty were reflecting on how much more central religion was in the life of families back then. I recall several founders talking about their kids being harassed in schools or by friends because of their lack of faith. Our Oakley Drive building was vandalized by youth who supposedly had been stirred up a bit by the Lutheran pastor down the street who spoke of devil worshipers such as us. The religious landscape has changed so much in terms of the diversity of faith in these areas and growing secularism. It's good to remember these founders are the ancestors of our congregation. Without them, we wouldn't be gathered here today. And like any other generation, we have to figure out how to carry the flame of a progressive beacon of faith in the northern suburbs forward, with gratitude for our heritage and humility for the task at hand. Blessed be, and amen.